psychologist as well. But let's start to talk about, if we need to introduce what I have difficulties in using this word, irrationality. But if we need to talk about irrational behavior, we need to talk about how life is. So let's a little bit introduce myself with respect to the relationship between myself and economics. Because indeed, when I was very young, in the last part of the 20th century, in the late 20th century, I was studying at the Liceo, and finishing Liceo, actually my dream was to become a writer, a novelist. I had passion to write, passion for Italian and European, worldwide literature. So I went to talk with my father, and I said, before um, trying to enter a university, and I say to my father, Dad, I want to study literature. I want to get a degree in humanities. And my dad told me very calm and serene, forget about it. I'm not going to pay taxes for you. You cannot attend a course of humanities at university. Actually, maybe for the foreign students, Italian are famous as bamboccioni, so we live till very late at home with our parents, which means that at the time I didn't want to challenge my father, and I basically said, okay, well, I'm not so motivated in studying humanities, and so let's see what else I can study, which basically got me with two options. One was law, and I immediately discarded law because my sister already had a degree in law, and I didn't want to become a solicitor. And then the other things I didn't consider medicine, because I think that for medicine you need to have a real passion. And therefore, at my times, you were out with just economics. Economics, just to be clear, was described by a very good English writer of the 19th century, Thomas Carlyle, as the dismal science. Dismal means cynical. Sometimes people report sad science, but the real adjective used by Carlyle is this dismal science. And this was my attitude towards economics and social sciences. I was thinking about economics as something not more than financial accounting, than numbers, than balance sheets, and I didn't have any interest in that. I have plenty of respect for what Emanuele Pizzurno studies and teaches, but I have not a passion for that. So I said, no, economics is really bad. It's the dark side of the force. You're there with finance, bank, corruption, and that's basically what was my attitude towards economics. So I went to look at the brochure of University Bocconi in Milan, and that was my attitude, because basically there was CLEA, corso di laurea in economia aziendale, basically business administration, CLEP, corso di laurea in economia politica, political economy, what in Anglo-Saxon terms is just economics, CLEFIN, corso di laurea in mercati finanziari, financial markets, CLAPI, amministrazioni pubbliche, public administration, and then finally DES. And actually, that was my point. I got immediately attracted by the difference of the initial DES. Discipline economiche e sociali. Social and economics disciplines. And indeed, in terms of marketing, it was a good strategy by University Bocconi, because social was what basically drove all of us, DES students, to attend that course. I'm talking about DES of the old organization of university, because now it has a little bit changed, but still discipline economiche e sociali. And what's the point? That I attended this course to study philosophy of science, history of political doctrine, sociology, history of science, which were there, but most importantly there was a lot of math, of statistics, of analysis. It was a very quantitative course, so that basically, although the real acronym is Discipline Economiche e Sociali, all DES students know that the real acronym of DES stands for Devo essermi sbagliato. I have to be wrong, because indeed I inscribed to a course because I expected something, and I faced a reality that was completely different. This is just to say that this is how life works. I mean, expectations are there, and it's very important to have expectations. But at the same time, most of the time, expectations are going to be denied by reality or modified a lot. And this will be important for you in the next months as long as you get close to the recruitment process. Because most of us believe to know what they want to do in their life. I mean, if you are like me, maybe you are more confused than anybody else. But some people are really passionate, and sometimes they discover that what they thought reality was is completely different from what facts demonstrated is. So, indeed, I started to study economics. I got my degree. After the degree, I started working a little bit in a consultancy company, only to discover I was definitely not keen for that job. I got fired from the consultancy company. It was a great day of my life. And then I started my very small and short academic career. I did my PhD at University Cattolica of Piacenza, University of Sussex. I had a postdoc in Paris School of Economics, and then I entered the very precarious world of Italian university till I got basically the call from Enzo Di Giulio inviting me to join Enrico Mattei School. Which is something very similar to what you do in university, although it's not a university. And actually, in all these years, I actually realized, and this is what I really want to share with my students, that the economics is fun. I mean, I really like to economics and social sciences because social sciences are everywhere and they are behind any our decision. So, in order to introduce behavioral economics, I have to say that behavioral economics, that is my research interest and the measure of my studies, taught me basically three things. The first of which um, drives me towards the narrative because I need to tell you a story just to let you understand one of these insights. Once upon a time, our story starts in LA, Los Angeles. It's 10 a.m. in Los Angeles and it's the 3rd of October of 1995. A beautiful sunny day, as usually it is in Los Angeles, but something very important is happening in the city. Why everybody is really focusing not only in Los Angeles, in all US and even outside US. The entire world is looking at what is happening in Los Angeles at 10 a.m. October 3rd, 1995. The army is in the streets. I mean, actually, the army is in the streets even in these days, unfortunately, in the US, but at the time it was there to control security and safety. Even President Clinton delivered a speech. Wall Street blocked its transaction at that time, and that was translated into a 40% reduction of transaction that day. So, what was happening that all the world was focusing attention on Los Angeles at that time? Basically, it was the day of the sentence of the judges against O.J. Simpson. You can watch the TV series on Netflix. I mean, it's amazing TV series. You basically know, I think, all of you, the story of this guy that was accused of having killed his wife, Nicole Brown. And there was a lot of evidence on that. But O.J. Simpson had hired, as a very rich person, the dream team of solicitors and lawyers and was defending himself against US. That was the day of the sentence. And I mean, of course, O.J. Simpson was incredibly tense that day because it was going to be guilty or not guilty. And as you know, the final sentence was that basically it was sentenced not guilty. This is the image of O.J. Simpson just after the pronouncement of the court of about his case. So his case is very interesting because he was accused of having killed with violence Nicole Kidman, yes, Nicole Brown, his wife, and her lover. And basically, everybody knew that several times in the past, O.J. Simpson had been denounced by his wife because of violence. It was actually a guy that continuously beat Nicole in the past. And actually, the defense admitted the fact. But, I mean, the dream team of lawyers that he hired was finding a way to defend O.J. Simpson. Well, the accusation was very simple. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, O.J. Simpson is a violent man, and therefore, so there is a correlation between the two facts. It's very likely that he has killed Nicole Brown, because as long as you are a violent person, it's extremely likely that you are going to be violent again, and that particularly applies to the case of your wife. So this was the main point of the accusation. How did the defense react to this accusation? Well, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, O.J. Simpson is a violent man, and we admit that, but, and that was the argument that they were trying, that they used, that they was going everywhere in the newspaper at the time. It was a quantitative argument, because the Dream Team took evidence from the official criminal records of violence against women, using data about US of the year before the crime committed, 1994. So the empirical evidence was showing what is represented in this graph, in this pie chart. So this very tiny slice solely for my acute represents women killed by a husband. So there was a total of 1,500 women killed by their husband that year, but the amount of women that denounced violence of their husband was much greater. It amounted to 4 million of people. So what's the point? And that was one of the major arguments of the defense. If you look at the ratio between people killed, I mean women killed by their husband, and women beaten by husband, that gives a probability of 1 over 2,500 that O.J. Simpson committed a homicide. It actually was a very, very famous and very shared argument, and it sounds brilliant, but it's wrong. And I hope that most of you realize that this argument is statistically wrong, because Nicole Brown is not only a woman beaten by her husband. So it's not only a person that reflects the population of the blue area, but Nicole Brown is a woman beaten by her husband, and logic connector, and she is also a woman killed by somebody. So the piece of evidence that was there is made of two elements. Is a woman that has been killed by somebody, and is a woman beaten by her husband. So actually, if we want to compute the real probability that O.J. Simpson committed homicide, we need to compute the ratio between not only women killed by husband, but also the real sample on which you need to compute this probability, which is the sample of women beaten by her husband and women killed by somebody. And number of people in this group is 1,800. So you realize what I'm saying. I'm saying that if we want to apply the logic of probability, actually the real graph would be like that, and the 1,500 out of 1,800 gives a probability of 88% that O.J. Simpson committed the homicide. I mean, it's a pretty different evidence. So what do we learn? Because this was an argument spread and spread by newspaper commentators, opinionists. So first insight that we can use is that we make mistakes, even when information is there, because it's not so easy to disentangle information. It's time consuming. Second insight, and there is a second story. It's very famous as well. If some of you have collected in the past the Guinness of records, This story is there. It's the incredible story of Roy Sullivan. Roy Sullivan, the man in the picture, was a ranger of the Canadian Army, and in April 1942, he was making his job in a forest in Canada. There was a storm, and Roy Sullivan had been hit by a lightning. He survived with no consequences in terms of health, and he went on making his job. July 1969, a few years passed, and Roy Sullivan was driving a truck, again making his job, and a storm began, and Roy Sullivan had been hit by a second lightning, and again he survived. In July 1970, at this time, Roy Sullivan was not working, but believe me or not, this is story. He was laying in the ground in the courtyard of his house. A storm began, and a lightning hit Roy Sullivan. That survived. To make it short, April 1972, August 1973, and it was not the oil shock, June 1976, June 1977, Roy Sullivan had been hit by 7 lightnings in a row. And he always survived, but that's the ironic surrealism of the story. September 1983, Roy Sullivan, that of course had some psychological problems because he started to believe that someone in the sky had something against him, he committed suicide. Most probably because he got refused by a lady. And what's interesting is that we can say that the 8th colpo di fulmine finally killed him. Why is that important, the story of Roy Sullivan? Because again, we need to think about probability. And we can think about probability by looking at the one probability that Italian students know pretty well. I mean, Superenalotto is the typical lottery, million euros lottery that each country in the world has, and the probability of winning Superenalotto, which means that you need to guess the 6 numbers out of 90 that are going to be extracted week after week, is this one. It's written actually in the ticket. Is 1 over 622,614,630, or 0.00002%. What's the point? The probability is there. We see the number, but can you visualize it? Because it's a very, very difficult to get an understanding of what we are talking about. We know that it's an incredibly tiny probability, but it doesn't say so much. So let's make this exercise, and this is my first suggestion. Always try to familiarize with numbers by making them visible. So let's start. Let's imagine that this course is gonna end in this way. I'm extracting just one person out of 30 who basically is going to answer a couple of questions of behavioral economics, and I mean the exam is entirely on that person, and then you get out of you pass the exam with that. So my point is, are you going to study if basically just one person out of 30 is going to be extracted to answer questions about behavioral economics? I don't know. Maybe if you are like me, you will say, no, I'm not going to ask. I mean, I'm not going to study because 1 over 30 is a very low probability. But this is something we easily visualize. I mean, this is our class. 1 over 30. So let's go up. And let's say that instead of having 30 persons, we go at Teatro La Scala in Milan, capable of 2,000 people, and then I get rid of the director of the orchestra before it starts the concert, and I'm gonna say I'm randomly extracting one person out of 2,000, and I'm asking questions to that person about behavioral economics, and it's gonna be marked on them. Are you going to study if you are 1 over 2,000 people? most likely the probability is going to be even lower than that. But we can still visualize it. Let's go on. The concert of the boss in San Siro. I mean, I miss concerts. 80,000 persons crowding the stadium. Everybody's there. I get rid of Bruce Springsteen on the podium. I take the microphone and I say to the 80,000 people, I'm gonna extract randomly one person out of 8,000 people. I'm gonna ask questions about behavioral economics. You're gonna be marked on that. Are you going to study if you are one over 80,000 people? Most likely no. Let's go on. 2000 Jubilee. John Paul II was still the Pope, and I mean there was an amazing gathering of millions of young people in Rome, 2 million. Let's imagine I get rid of the Pope, I take the microphone, I say to that 2 million people, I'm gonna extract randomly one of you, and I'm gonna ask you questions about behavioral economics. You're gonna be marked on that. How are you going to study? No. Let's scale up. Europe, more than 500 million people. I don't even know if there is a possibility of making a communication with the microphone to all of the 500 million people, but I'm gonna say or write a message to all 500 million inhabitants in Europe. I'm gonna extract a person to ask a question about behavioral economics. Are you gonna study? I mean, it's easy. No. Still, 1 over 500 millions is consistently a higher probability than the probability of winning at Superenalotto. And the probability of winning at Superenalotto is lower than the probability of being hit by 7 lightnings in a row. So, what is the insight we get from this story? Is that sometimes strange events happen and almost impossible events too, and that affect our perception of reality. Finally, and that's important as well, behavioral economics is important because mainly, if I have to explain what behavioral economics is, I already said, is the study of economic decision through the use of experiment. There is not only econometrics or surveys to study human behavior, asking people what do they think about something. There is experiments, and experiments are important because they are the only, I would say, reliable methodology in order to find a causal relationships between a y, a dependent variable, and a x. Some of you are gonna read the book The Y-Axis by Ulrich Nisis that exactly disentangles this relationship. How do we run experiments in social sciences? Basically, the typical case is that of lab experiments. Lab experiments means that there is a lab, like the one you see in the picture, although it's a little bit old, where you recruit subject of the experiment between whom? Between students. Typically, the main subjects of an experiment in economics and social sciences are students, graduate students of university. Why that? I'm gonna back on that later, but because there are many, they continue to come in university with new course, and they're cheap because you need to pay subjects of an experiment in economics in order to make a reliable economic experiment. So the recruited subjects come into the lab, they sit at the table where there is typical a laptop like the one you see. No communication is there. I mean, typically even visual, like you see, there are barriers between one table and the other. And each of the students is assigned a secret ID, which guarantees anonymity. I'm gonna back in the very last level of our course, ethics, to talk about the importance of preserving privacy of people. And typically, students, subjects of the experiment, find on the laptop instruction on the PC, and there is also a paperback copy that the experimenter reads together with the subjects in order to warm up and make sure that everybody understands the rule of the experiment. Because what you're gonna do is to observe people making a task, and the task implies typically decisions, and that is the object of studying economic decision through an experiment. So lab experiment, and you already met them during the course in economics. I'm talking about the first level economics students that I met, but also the second level economics students, because I know you use the core manual. Natural experiments are very important. What are natural experiments? Sometimes in history, reality sets something that creates a neat separation between a before and an after, creating the typical artificial condition of an experiment. The typical case is that of thinking about 1947 separation overnight between North Korea and South Korea. It's an homogeneous population, that are the Koreans, that share language, share culture. One part, the North, goes with the Soviet Union bloc. The other part, the South, goes with the market economy US world. And then you may use these two randomly generated population in order to observe, for example, the role played by institution in affecting some magnitudes, GDP growth, inflation, unemployment, and so on and so forth. Natural experiments are very difficult to find in reality because, of course, not always is the case. I mean, typically we are talking about, you maybe have read that COVID-19 creates the possibility of setting up natural experiments in order to observe behavior of people in different conditions that are generated by an exogenous shock like the pandemics we are living in. Then there are also field experiments. Field experiments are actually experiments managed by researchers. So there is a real intervention of researchers, but in the field, which means that basically you run the experiment in reality, and is what maybe you know as randomized control trial, which is a term very famous thanks to the work, the seminal work of Esther Duflo, and some of you are is going to read the books by Esther Duflo and her husband Banerjee. Randomized control trial are the typical experiments run by researchers in order to test an hypothesis. For example, here we have a population of people, and that population is an homogeneous population of unemployed person. That population is gonna be randomly split in two groups. Randomization is an incredibly important element of each experiment because you have to be sure that the belonging to one group or to another is random, is not associated to an identifiable external characteristics. Like, for example, if you put all men here and all women here, you cannot be sure that the reason why you observe different results is associated to what you test or the gender of the subjects. So population has to be split into two groups. That is how it works. Also, the test of a vaccine, you split the population of people into two groups. One is gonna treat it with the vaccine, the other is gonna treat it with the placebo or nothing. And basically, here we have unemployed people that get the intervention. Let's say you want to test the efficacy of income subsidy furnished to unemployed people. And this is the treated group. The control group is the second group, and it's very important because it's made of people that are unemployed as well, and they are looking for work, but basically they are not treated with the income subsidy. So for them, reality goes on in the status quo. Then you have finally for the duration of the protocol, an observation, a number of points that give you what? The outcome. How many people out of the treaty group find a job, and how many people of the control group find a job. And then you're going to compare the two groups, and that gives you the causal role played by your intervention, the income subsidy in our case, on the probability of finding a job. Of course, this is a causal relationship because we want to isolate the net effect of the intervention out of a context in which everything else is the same. Some people pose a question of ethics. Why and how do I choose to give some people an intervention like an income subsidy and some other are not going to get it? I mean, this is a good question, but let's enter the world of empirical assessment of policy measures. I mean, the experiment is run on a subsample of people in order to understand if the benefits of a measure are greater than the cost, and then you generalize the the intervention, if it is effective, to the entire population. So my question would be rather, what is the cost of not running an experiment? If, for example, you start by entirely giving the income subsidy to the whole population, but then you do not have any real number showing that the measure is extremely effective or not. This is very important. And I mean, that's the reason why, for example, even for drugs, you basically have a treatment and a control group. Even there, you can ask ethically, why do we select some people and some other not? Because we need to test the efficacy of a measure. So, what are the keywords of the experimental setting? First of all, you need to have a protocol, the set of procedures, which include instruction, the subjects involved, the nature of the incentive you use, and get on back in a minute. The rules of the game. So the protocol has to be transparent, clear, and share with all the public, because there may be the temptation for the researchers to not clarify what are the outcome that they expect, and then you manipulate results, you find something that works, but you need to make it clear from scratch, from the beginning, what is the outcome you expect to measure. For example, for an income subsidy, I want to find how many people out of my population find a job if they are unemployed. Then another very important word, the treatment, which is basically the group on which you test your hypothesis. In our case, people unemployed, they get the income subsidy. But this is something that students sometimes misunderstand. What is more important in an experiment, the treatment group or the control group, which is the group for which nothing changes? Actually, the answer is that the most important element of an experiment is the control group, because the control group is going to be my base reference, so important in order to establish a causal relationship between y and x. Is the entire meaning of the experiment to control the environment. Otherwise, I cannot have the guarantee, the warranty of a ceteris paribus condition. What are the goals of an experiment? I mean, experiments may be useful to test a theory, and we will make a lot of examples about that during our course. So you may have a neoclassical framework to test. How do markets behave in reality, but also how is decision making behaving in reality? So you test a theory that is existent, but you can also provide new knowledge. And if you provide new knowledge, you also provide a new theory. And then you may also contribute to real decision making of people. The example provided with respect to the income subsidy for the unemployed is exactly that sort of experiment that has a goal of informing policies. And it's very important as a tool for classroom management and learning practices, because experiment and game in classroom are very important to test your ability to uh, understand the concept. So you may actually run experiments, small experiment in class, in order to test the comprehension of a concept for students. Who are the subjects of an experiment? I mean, I already said that typically students are hired, and I already said why. There are many. They change one year after another. They are cheap if you need to pay, and typically the budget for an experiment is $15 each. I mean, it may be more, but I mean, now it's even $30, but for an hour of your time. So students actually get paid $30 for 1 hour, and that is actually, if you consider yourself in your life as a student, that's a kind of fair payment. So you may be reasonably sure that people and students are gonna behave accordingly because they get paid for what they do. Children may be subjects of an experiment, especially, and of course, when you run an experiment with children, ethics is so much important, and you need to have a psychologist to help you. I mean, I'm working with the director of Museo del Risparmio, Giovanna Palladino, on building up and collecting a survey on 14, 18 years old high school students in Italy. And we need to have a psychologist validating the questionnaires we build up and all the procedures to collect answers for these people. Typically, children, even small children, are tested if you want to know if there is some innate characteristics of human beings that basically determine such behaviors. Tribes, anthropology, that is important. Jared Diamond, that I was maybe quoting. No, I did not. But Jared Diamond is an anthropologist that uses a lot natural experiment. You may test the existence of a ancient and like pre-evolutionary behavior of human beings by observing how tribes even behave today, because they are isolated from the role played by the environment and social norms. Animals. Some researchers study the behavior of animals to show the existence of a pattern that is similar to human beings. I mean, brain of human beings and animals is different, of course, but there is also some components that are very similar. Professionals and real agents, again, the field experiments are there. You can test for field experiments people in their real life and real job. In terms of the procedure, how do you run an experiment? Maybe hot versus cold. What does it mean? That you may ask people to try to predict and self-report their behavior in a peculiar situation. So you ask people to how they would behave in a certain condition, and that implies strategic thinking, or you may observe real behavior and you want to test immediate reaction, especially neuroeconomics. So neuroscience uses fMRI, frequency magnetic resonance image, in order to observe which part of the brain activate when you make a decision. Very costly, very expensive, very promising as a line of research in the future. So very important as well, between subjects experiment or within subject experiment. What does it mean? That you may test a population, divided that population in two random groups of different people, and that is the between subjects. So you observe difference in behavior between different subjects or within subjects. It may be the case that you observe a population starting to collect data, and then you apply the treatment on the same population in order to observe the before and after treatment. Incentives are very important for experiments in social sciences and in economics. You need to pay subjects that are recruited for an experiment real money. And of course, that is an issue because the budget of an experiment is not so much, and you need to be sure that you're going to not lose money in making the wrong experiment. But not always money is the best motivator of people. If, as I was telling you, hire children to observe their behavior, money is not working. You may use toys, candies, in order to observe their behavior in a more intrinsic way. But also gamification may be important. Some people get motivation through the competition, and then just the fact of competing gives an incentive to be consistent during the experiment. Or think about students. Marks are important. You get a percentage of your marks depending on how you behave during experiments. Techniques. I mean, in the old times of behavioral economics, talking about the 70s of the last centuries, paper was there. So you collected questionnaires, you gave the experiments paper on which they wrote their answer. But then most of the labs have been shifted in a computer lab, basically, and each people is in front of a computer. And even if you couple people, you are basically in front of a screen, and on another screen your opponent is there in order to play with you. fMRI was talking about the very recent development of neuroeconomics that uses magnetic resonance in order to evidentiate the part of the brain that they activate when you make a decision. What's the point? I mean, neuroimages. I mean, it's a very promising frontier of study, but it's very costly and expensive. 1 hour of fMRI costs $600. I spent a month a few years ago with Inni and I at UCLA, where a friend of mine, a colleague of the time of University Bocconi, Martin Monti, who is director of the Monti Lab in UCLA, runs lots of experiments with the fMRI. And at the time, I'm talking about 2013, 1 hour of fMRI for patient costed $600. Now I think it's it's much less, but still, of course, if you think about the budget of an experiment in the lab, that is more or less $30 per student, and you compare it with the cost of running an experiment in the hospital where the machine for the magnetic resonance is there, you see immediately that the cost is not comparable. It's much more expensive, and it's not so clear yet how advantageous it may be to use this technology in order to really advance in knowledge of how our brain works. So what I would like to stress is that thanks to the use of experiments, we can question the method of self-report that typically is the way in which we analyze behaviors of people by asking them what do they think, what do they do. But or even in marketing strategies, this is the typical case of focus groups that have nothing to do with experiment, because the focus groups is like the special focus on a segment of clients or experts without any sort of control and without any sort of representativeness of that population, of the entire population. So maybe they provide qualitative information that is important, but it's something else to say that that information is robust as well. So when you ask people through a survey, what do they think? We need to ask ourselves, are people declaring what they really want or what they expect the researcher wants to be told? So in some aspects, when it is possible, it's better to study real behavior to the help of an experiment. Now, ending up this first part, I would say that I always use this image. This is the amazing fresco by Raffaello Sanzio, La Scuola di Atene, that you can visit in Musei Vaticani in Rome. Amazing fresco realized by Raffaello Sanzio when he was incredibly young, less than 30 years old, and it's the summary of basically philosophy, of course, from the perspective of a man of the Renaissance. And I always stress the attention of students on the scene. I mean, this is an amazing way of summing up philosophy, because at the center of the scene, we have these two guys. One is Plato on the left, who has the resemblance of Leonardo da Vinci, that was the model for Plato. And on the right, we have Aristotle, who was a scholar of Plato. And not randomly, they are at the center of the scene, because they are at the center of the Greek philosophy. What's the point? Raffaello doesn't do anything randomly. The two guys are catched in a very open discussion, because Plato, if you look at his right hand, is pointing up to the sky. Why that? Because the main concept of Platonic philosophy is the concept of idea. What is the idea? Is the essence of reality. You can have the idea of a chair, but then the chair that you see in reality is like a real is just a resemblance of that idea. It's never the realization of the perfect idea. And not surprisingly, on the left hand, I mean, if you go on Google and search for a zoom in of this fresco, you will see that the dialogue that Plato has in his hands is not a random dialogue, it's Timeo. And for the person between you that studied Plato at the Lyceum or university, Timeo is the dialogue of Plato in which Plato talks about his vision of the universe. So here Raffaele is saying actually abstraction going into the essence is the essence of Plato philosophy. And I always simplify by saying that the neoclassical framework in economics is very Platonic, because you make hypotheses about human behavior, you assume individuals to be perfectly rational, and you deduce something by starting from that hypothesis, and you simplify reality through the help of models that are not descriptive at all. They are catching the essence of human behavior. On the other side of our square, we have Aristotle. Aristotle is scholar of Plato, and with his right hand is pointing clearly to the ground, because in Aristotle, philia is the relationship between human beings. Aristotle says we need to start from real observation of relationships between human beings and of physical reality. I mean, Aristotle is considered the father of natural philosophy, that today we call science. So I use Aristotle as a good example of what experiments do, because this is a descriptive approach to study human behavior. The relationship between Plato and Aristotle, the relationship between neoclassical framework and experimental framework, is not that of an opposition. I don't like that sort of narrative. I think that the two are complement. It's very important to have a normative approach to study human behavior, as well as the importance of using empirical evidence to observe human behavior and decision as well. So it's important to study neoclassical models and to study also the approach provided by the experimental branch. Okay, we can keep it up with the second part. I'm showing up to say hello, if I can. Camera, fotocamera, così vi saluto. I was keeping it up. See you in the next part of level 1. Ciao!